perspective presented by the New Orleans Secular Humanist Association, following a few principles of humanism.
We're committed to the use of science and reason for understanding the universe and for solving human problems. We're skeptical of untested claims of knowledge, but we're open to new ideas.
We are concerned with securing justice and fairness in society and in ending intolerance and discrimination. We are committed to the total separation of religion and government.
We affirm humanism as a realistic alternative to the theologies of despair and the ideologies of violence. We reject the concept of an afterlife and believe in living a full and rewarding life here and now.
We value and respect each individual's right to judge and lead their lives according to their own position, as long as it's respectful of other people, living in a free society.
We hope you enjoy today's program and others in the weeks to follow.
Mary Schippers?
Mimi.
Mimi Schippers? Okay. And today's our topic is about polyamory. And I would imagine a whole lot of people don't know what polyamory is. So as the expert, I'll have you jump in on that.
Sure. So polyamory is, the word is poly, meaning multiple.
Right.
And amory refers to love. So it means multiple loves. And so it refers to people who have intimate, emotional, sometimes sexual relationships with more than one person.
Excellent. How did you get interested in the topic?
Well, I've always felt like I would prefer a non-monogamous relationship.
Right.
And so for most of my adult life, I've been in non-monogamous relationships, and that means that we didn't agree to be monogamous with each other. It was agreed that we would be, we could have sexual relationships with people outside of the relationship. And then, I don't know, maybe 15 years ago, I read a book by Deborah Anapol. And she sort of lays out what polyamory is, and it made perfect sense to me. And so I was interested in the topic personally,
right.
But as a sociologist and as a gender studies scholar, I thought there were some interesting things about polyamory that, as a relationship form, it might have some interesting effects on people's sense of their own gender identity or sexual identity,
right.
And how people do interpersonal relationships.
I see. So how would you say that polyamory is different than non-monogamy, or is it just a part of non-monogamy? How would you define it?
Well, polyamory has emerged as an internet subculture.
Right.
And that's what makes it a little different from previous cultures that were into non-monogamy or into multiple loves.
Right.
So there's sort of a subcultural ethos that has developed, that, people writing about polyamory. And most of the time, or until very recently, people distinguish polyamory from consensual non-monogamy, and that polyamory emphasizes interpersonal emotional attachment as well as the sexual.
Right.
So people can be non-monogamous. They can have a non-monogamous relationship and not be polyamorous, in that they can have sex with other people, but they can't form love or emotional relationships with those other people. And then polyamorists, there are polyamorous who might have multiple relationships, but they're monogamous within those relationships. So those relationships would be what polyamorous call polyfidelitous, which means that they're monogamous with each other. Not monogamous, but they don't have sex with people outside of the relationship. So you can have a consensually non-monogamous relationship and not be polyamorous at all, and be polyamorous and not have an open or consensually non-monogamous relationship.
So I think a lot of people, when they hear these things, they think of like maybe 60s free love, or maybe a man marrying multiple women. Can you address how is this different than those?
Well, it's not different in that polyamory, like the idea of free love in the 60s, and like polygamy, you're referring to, actually it's called polygyny, when one man is married to multiple women. Polygamy is generally plural marriage.
I see.
So it's similar in that it's not based on a couple ideal.
I see.
That the structure of the relationship isn't dyad, a couple. But it's really different in a lot of ways in that part of the polyamory subculture includes a commitment to gender egalitarianism, or the idea that regardless of one's gender, you can develop relationships with multiple people.
Right.
And free love was similar in that, in theory, it was okay for anybody to practice free love, but there wasn't a cultural emphasis on gender equality.
I see.
A lot of people talk about free love in the 60s as, it was a rejection of the old rules of the 50s that was like, marriage, no sex before marriage.
Right.
And the free love idea was have sex with whenever you want and with whomever you want. But there was no critical perspective on gender relations.
Gender roles, right.
Yeah. So free love was actually a lot about young men having access to women without questioning sort of the way they did the intimate and sexual relationships. So feminism and gender egalitarianism is a big part of polyamory. In theory, in the subculture.
Right.
In practice, we don't really know because there's very little research on how people do polyamory.
Right. Now, is polyamory new? Is this a new, like you said, it became an internet subculture. Is that when it began, or do we see that in history?
The first, I believe, the word polyamory was offered as a label for this way of doing relationships in the late 90s.
Okay.
And part of my research was to think about, what's happening with polyamory now becoming more popular. And what I found was that prior to 2006, there are no mentions in the mainstream media of polyamory.
Right.
And then in 2006, all of a sudden, there start to trickle in here and there. Outlets in the mainstream media are referring to or talking about polyamory. And now if you do a Google search, you'll get hundreds of thousands of hits. Right. So it is relatively new. The practice isn't, but the label to refer to it is.
So you would say that pre this new era, there was polyamorous style relationships before, like in historical times, maybe.
Yeah. And in fact, the book that I just finished, one of my chapters I talk about historical biographies,
right.
And there are 6 people in that chapter that I talk about that lived a polyamorous life. They didn't, of course, use the term,
right.
But they were polyamorous in practice. And the biographers, what I write about is how the biographers couldn't see it. They just thought that each of these people in history, people like Emma Goldman, and people like William Marston, who developed the character Wonder Woman.
I see.
Audre Lorde, right? So all of these people were committed to not living as a monogamous couple and had multiple partners. But the biographers see that part of what they did as weird or strange or look at this freaky part of their life.
Yeah, exactly.
As separate from their politics and their political agenda. And so what I'm arguing is that the polyamory is central to their political agenda.
So, what about further back in time? Is this like just a 20th century phenomena that's happening, or is that the beginnings of it, or does it go back further than that?
I think that it goes all the way back. I think that the sociological evidence suggests that very few people are monogamous for their lifetime. So monogamy itself is very rare.
Right.
Over the course of a lifetime. But I think that people have been doing this all along. They've just remained closeted, or they didn't call it that. And, I think that the whole patriarchal male head of household family in the American context and in the European context, there's always been sort of this the upper middle class men are going to have a mistress,
right,
and a long-term mistress. And though it's not polyamory in that everybody doesn't consent and go along, and it's not gender egalitarian, it is poly,
right,
in that those men have multiple partners. And we don't know is the social scientific answer or historical answer, because people haven't looked.
Right.
So, but I think people have been doing it for a long time.
I see. Well, I think one idea that when people are thinking about, when they hear this, the subject of polyamory, they think that when they imagine themselves in that situation, the first thing they're going to think of is how they can deal with jealousy.
Yeah.
So, and how would you address that? How do you, in your own relationships and how you've seen others, how would you deal with jealousy? And it seems to be so the first thing that people think of.
Yeah, and it's the first question I get. Right. How do you deal with the jealousy? And my answer is usually, we, as a culture, we tend to think that jealousy is different from other kinds of emotions. And so jealousy is something to avoid. Like, jealousy is scary. You don't want to feel jealous. And I think that is fundamentally embedded in sort of a capitalist idea that you possess each other. Like, possession is the way to do things. And if someone's going to take your possession, that's deeply threatening.
Yeah, it's embedded in the language. This is my girl. This is my guy.
My one and only.
Right.
Yeah. So everybody experiences jealousy. I have experienced jealousy. All of my partners have experienced jealousy. I've met a few people who identify as polyamorists, as polyamorists who say they never are jealous, and, good for them.
You speculate they're lying?
I don't think they're lying.
All right.
I wouldn't say that, but it's hard for me to imagine never feeling jealous. When I feel jealousy, so avoiding jealousy is not the goal.
I see.
And it also, the idea that in polyamory you would be jealous, but in monogamy you'd never feel jealous.
Right.
Anyone who's monogamous is going to know that's not the case.
Right.
It's just what you do with the jealousy.
Right.
So when I feel jealous, I focus on myself and I think, okay, so what's going on with this jealousy? Is there a threat? Because jealousy as an emotion is very much about fear.
Yeah.
Fear of loss and anger as well.
Right.
So what do I fear? Am I really in a position where I might lose something I cherish? And if I am in that situation, then what I do is I talk to everybody involved. Hey, listen, I'm afraid I'm going to lose something here. And if I assess it and sort of step back and think that I'm really not going to lose something here, it means that my insecurities are leading to the jealousy. It's not something outside of me.
Right.
So I manage it. Sometimes successfully, sometimes not as successfully. But jealousy for me is an emotion that teaches me something
Right.
rather than something to avoid.
And is that conversation that you're saying you have with everyone involved, right? Is that generally accepted in the culture?
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
expected that you're going to
It's
be having those.
expected, it's encouraged, and so it's not unusual.
Right.
I've never had a situation where I've said, listen, I'm feeling a little, my word is hinky, like, I'm feeling kind of hinky about this. No one has ever said to me interpersonally, what the hell is wrong with you?
Yeah.
I don't want to be with you anymore.
Right,
like all of my fears coming true. But there is a strong emphasis in polyamory subculture to focus on yourself rather than the interpersonal dynamics. And that's one of the things that I really wanted to tease out as a sociologist and a gender sociologist,
Right.
because jealousy is gendered. So as a culture, we expect men to feel more jealous
Right.
than women, and we sort of legitimate, we think it's okay for men to be jealous and express that jealousy, whereas we see women expressing anger and jealousy as a problem.
Right.
And so I've been lucky in that I've never had an experience where someone has said, settle down, or
Right.
there's the door.
Right.
But the emphasis on the individual, like check yourself, check your own insecurities that's operating in the subculture, doesn't recognize the interpersonal and social dynamics of jealousy.
That's interesting. Yeah. So what would you say is, because you're kind of out, and it seems like the polyamorous community is similar to like maybe the early gay rights community or gay and lesbian rights community, where they don't necessarily come out to everybody because of public reactions.
Yeah.
What are those public reactions that you've seen? Because I have friends of mine who are polyamorous, and they said they refer to their coming out like to their best friend, and how they were relieved that their best friend didn't want to end the relationship with them. So what is the public reaction, and if you have any personal anecdotes, that'd be interesting too.
Yeah. So I came out to my family right after Hurricane Katrina. I was with two partners at the time, and we all were separated. And so going to my family, seeking shelter with my family as a family was not an option. And, I was in the state that a lot of us were in after Hurricane Katrina, and being so displaced that I was like, what the heck, So I told my sisters, and they were like, ooh,
scandalous.
Yeah, ooh, you're so lucky. And then they say, aren't you jealous?
So they recognize an opportunity as well as the dynamics of it.
Yeah, it's, that sounds great. Aren't you jealous? I could never do it.
Right.
But, I'll live vicariously. And my brothers said that they would pray for me.
So they're a religious community.
My brothers are, yeah. And I've never talked to my father about it, but I eventually talked to my mother about it. And, I talked about my two partners, and she's like, oh, no, I was talking about writing the book. And she said, what are you writing about? And I said, polyamory. And she's like, what's that? And I said, well.
And that's how you introduced it.
Yeah. I said, well, it's when you have two partners or two or more partners like I do.
Like in a business?
People think that when I say partners. And like I do. And she said, oh, Mimi, I knew you were weird, but I didn't know you were that weird. So, relatively positive
acceptance,
experience. Yeah. But people don't tell me often what they think, and then it shows up later.
Yeah.
Like, for instance, I have a colleague that apparently disagrees with my lifestyle, and it became a professional issue about a year ago.
Well, that's a shame.
Yeah.
Is it?
It's hard.
Yeah, and so it can impact work.
I'm lucky. I'm an academic,
right?
And I didn't come out as polyamorous until I had tenure,
right? Intentionally, right?
Intentionally, absolutely. And I didn't write about polyamory until I got tenure, intentionally. a woman who has done a lot of the research in sociology on polyamory, Elizabeth Sheff. She actually was denied tenure because she did research on polyamory. So, yeah, and I'm an academic. I have tenure, so I really can't be fired for it.
Right.
But there's no legal protections
Right.
for relationship status. So I know lots of people who are teachers or are in public office or have, a position where they just can't, because there are negative perceptions about it. People immediately think, "Oh, pervert."
Right,
like,
right.
It's
just similar
it's
to
all
what
about
the
the
similar way the
sex.
gays were being treated when they were coming out, right? Gays and lesbians.
Exactly.
Right.
And similarly with gay and lesbian people, when I tell people I'm polyamorous, all of a sudden, or very often, people will all of a sudden be like, "Ooh, does that mean you're going to hit on me?" Or with polyamory, what's different from being gay or lesbian, they think, "Are you going to hit on my wife or husband?"
Right, right.
Like, don't give my partner any ideas. So I've noticed with some people sort of kind of moving away socially.
Once they identify.
Yeah.
I see.
Yeah.
Well, that has to be a challenge. What about the benefits of being in a relationship? I think we kind of went over some of that already. Oh, that's right. I was going through my list of questions. Well, what about the different? I have friends of mine who are polyamorous, and they kind of try to explain it to me. And there's the common one that the common sort of relationship structure that has been explained to me is that you have a primary partner, and then you have a second, which is not they're kind of in a different categorization about it's a loving relationship, but it's not the same as the primary. And then I get the impression that there's more configurations than that.
Yes.
So can you maybe break down somehow how it might work?
Sure. So primary partners, like you said, are usually financially interdependent. They might share a household. They define their relationship with each other in a hierarchy as the top, the most important. There's nothing that can come between them. They won't sacrifice that relationship for any other relationship.
Right.
And in that sort of relationship, other partners are referred to as secondary.
Right.
And then there are tertiary partners who are peripheral, maybe don't spend as much time, have no interpersonal responsibilities. But increasingly people are being critical of that sort of hierarchy of relationships. It puts secondaries in a really vulnerable position. If something goes awry, often secondary people will feel or are expendable.
Right.
So it's a very difficult position to be in. And it can also cause problems if the secondary person is perceived by one of the partners as emerging as a primary.
I see.
That can cause
a threat.
conflict.
And
It becomes a threat.
It's
Yeah.
a jealousy thing again.
Yeah. But increasingly people are talking about this idea of relationship anarchy, which I find really compelling. And it's the idea that no relationships, regardless of their nature, are better than other relationships or more important than other relationships. They're just different.
Right.
And for a relationship anarchist, it's not even limited to emotionally intimate or sexual relationships. It's all relationships. So friendships are no different from lover relationships. They are different.
Right.
Let me choose my language carefully.
I would assume so, right?
Yeah, but they're not. We live in a culture that encourages us to think that our partners are more important than anyone else in our life.
Right.
And relationship anarchists would encourage us to not make that assumption.
Right.
And decide who spends time with whom based on needs, interests, and what you want to do with each other.
Right. Right. And so is that like the basic two models then? You have this like hierarchical model and then more an anarchistic model? Is that what you would say?
Yeah. In terms of the labels.
Right, right.
In practice, of course, these things are always
Right.
do it as you go. Do
Right,
it yourself.
right.
DIY.
I see.
Yeah.
Now, would you classify? You mentioned a couple of times that that you think that monogamy is sort of emerges or associated with capitalistic tendencies. Would you say that this is that polyamory is a more progressive or more feminist relationship style?
No, I don't think I would say that. I think that there's nothing inherently progressive or anti-capitalist or transgressive about polyamory. But I do think that there is potential in polyamory that doesn't exist in the couple relationship. That polyamory as a relationship structure or form really questions the idea of possessing each other as a virtue.
Right.
It also, like I said, it opens up really interesting dynamics with gender relations. So Elizabeth Sheff's research shows that men who are in polyamorous relationships often experience a change in their sense of masculinity because they have to let go of the idea that they're entitled to jealousy and entitled to control their partners and entitled to anger towards their partners or towards the partner's partners,
right.
The other people that their partners are involved with. And the women that she interviewed expressed a transformation in their own sense of sexual subjectivity. Women felt more entitled to sexual pleasure. They felt more entitled to claiming autonomy in relationship to their partners. And so, that sort of preliminary research suggests that it requires some kind of transformation in the way people think about their own sense of gender identity.
I see. So what about? I think another like knee-jerk criticism of polyamory would be that the relationship wouldn't last as long because it doesn't have the commitment of a monogamous relationship. What would be your response to that?
Well, most relationships end. I mean, to be perfectly frank, there are very few people who get into a partnership and stay in that partnership for a lifetime.
Right.
And that's increasingly the case.
Right.
So most relationships end. Polyamory is very difficult. And it's difficult because we don't have a social scaffolding for it. I don't get the accolades. I don't get the, congratulations for having more than one partner that a person would have if they partner up in a monogamous couple relationship.
Right.
And often people who aren't polyamorous don't recognize it, and so they don't treat other partners the same way as they would treat the initial partner, or what some people would call their primary partner.
Well, very good. I think that ends our time that we have together.
That was really fast.
Well, thank you for coming.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.